and welcome to the latest installation in Regular Warfare Initiative's Fireside Chat series. I'm here with Olga and John from the European program of IWI. Excited to dig into current events in Europe, talking about particularly Ukraine and the wider situation that's unfolding. And keeping with the theme of IWI and what we do and how we do it, it's really focused in on trying to get unique perspectives from people who've been there and had firsthand experience. I think everybody on the call here today has that in significant measure. So, John, super excited to have you here. Olga, thank you as always. And I want to kick this off. You know, there's lots of talk of hybrid war and the war in Ukraine, and the big picture story is pretty well known. I think everyone tuning in here has all that. And I want to kick it off with maybe a different question, a different way of thinking about it, John. And this is looking at putting ourselves in the shoes of strategists in the Kremlin, looking back at 10, 15, 20 years of Russian statecraft toward Ukraine, and think about the lessons they might have learned and what that might mean for Europe right now, and for the United States to an extent. And what I've got to believe is that there are people there looking back at the near past, the distant past, and the current reality, and wondering if the whole playbook they used on Ukraine might have been the wrong one. There might have been a fundamentally different way to apply it. And I'm asking that with the view that, you know, the intent of Russia had been to divide, distract, subjugate the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people to keep them in the Kremlin's orbit. That was meant to be done with this quote unquote hybrid approach. But ultimately, the hybrid approach didn't deliver a strategic result, and they pivoted toward full-scale invasion. And what they found when they did that was they'd actually created the enemy that they didn't want to fight, right? The Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian military, and Ukrainian society were, I think, exponentially more formidable of an opponent than they would have been in 2013 or in 2007, or pick your date in the past, before all this had come to pass and before the Russians had done what they'd done. And again, the Russian playbook inflicted damage, it imposed costs, et cetera, et cetera. So it worked in the tactical sense fairly well, but it didn't deliver strategically. And when there was time for a pivot, they encountered something they really, I don't think, expected. I think there's a pretty good consensus among those of us who watch this space that the Russians expected a much different outcome 4 years ago when they launched the full-scale invasion. And so I wonder your thoughts on that rationale as someone with extensive experience in Ukraine and across the former Soviet Union, and the extent to which this might cause a bit of additional urgency in Europe. Because if we think of ourselves in a wider geopolitical environment right now, where the rules-based order, quote unquote, isn't what it used to be, might we see the Russians take much more aggressive action in the future, using the full spectrum of capabilities at their disposal, but in a much more rapid fashion? John, welcome. Have a go. Thank you.
Thank you again, Nick and Olga. Great to be here with both of you. Really happy to be a fellow with the IWI Europe project team. That's a great question to kick off with. So certainly, I think a couple of different things. I think the Kremlin has underestimated Western resolve since 2014, particularly in terms of the amount of unity, despite some challenges here or there over the past decade or so. But the amount of unity in supporting Ukraine's ambitions as an independent sovereign state in terms of wanting to focus on a Western trajectory, if you will. And we've seen evidence of that resolve through continued political, economic, and military support over the last 12 years or so, quite significant support. I think also the Russians underestimated Ukrainian unity. There are natural tensions in Ukraine in terms of, language, ethnicity, and or region, if you will, historically as well. And I think the Russians tried to play at those differences and try to leverage those differences to create disharmony, disunity, and discord within Ukraine. And in some cases, again, at a tactical level, in some cases, there are examples where that has worked. But you're right, strategically, that has been a massive failure. That Ukrainian unity has been one of the major significant strategic outcomes of this, which is certainly not something I think the Kremlin or Moscow anticipated. I'll stop there.
I actually would like to go back to what you've mentioned about Western resolve, and to maybe have you speak a little bit more about what it was that triggered you to write the book from your experience in the field. And the second layer to my question is, now that the US-led, the Western resolve that you talked about was, and the support for Ukraine was very much US-led. Given the changes at the macro level in the IR system, what do you think the Europeans, especially from an IW perspective, should change or could be contemplating to change in their approach?
Certainly. So I also think the Europeans have learned a lot over the last 12 years, as much as the Russians and Ukrainians have also. We've seen Russia operating in all domains, using both kinetic and non-kinetic instruments, if you will, to probe and see what works. And I think at least prior to the full-scale invasion of February 2022, although there were some military operations that were conducted, some kinetic operations, obviously, in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea, I think the Russians tended to focus on those tools, those activities that would be or allow for plausible deniability to mitigate a potential more conventional response from the West, if you will. And so that would be through what we have been mostly describing as hybrid warfare, but information operations, political influence operations, using energy or gas as a lever or pressure point as well, funding certain media outlets, that sort of thing. And there've been varying degrees of effectiveness by the Russians on this, again, at tactical levels, not necessarily strategic ones. So I think the Europeans have learned a lot from that. And I think they've invested quite a bit, not only in economic and military assistance to Ukraine over the last 12 years, and also the European members of NATO increasing their defense expenditures also, although that's still a work in progress. I think going forward, what we really need to see from Europe as well is to certainly increase, particularly the members of NATO, but even those who are not NATO members, to understand that the Russian threat is real. It's not just rhetoric. And you're seeing it firsthand, not only in Ukraine in terms of the conventional or more conventional aspect of the war over the last 4 years, but again, this continued probing of Europe, East, Central, and Western Europe, if you will, the number of sabotage operations against transport facilities, defense installations that support the Ukraine effort against Russia, Ukraine's effort to defend itself. I think we're going to see that continue. And so I think going forward, the Europeans really need to invest more in infrastructure protection, invest more in cyber hardening, if you will, given all the cyber attacks, invest more in whole of society resilience, if you will, ensuring that their publics understand better the Russian threats and how those threats may emanate in the information space, the political space, if you will. Also investing more in political party, political and financial transparency, if you will, so that the average European understands where funding is coming from, and to identify and to attribute, if you will, if any of that funding is coming from Russian sources or Russian-backed sources, so that the average European can make a decision for herself or himself as to whether or not to support such a party. I think all that's going to be extremely important going forward, as I imagine Russia will continue its sabotage operations, let alone conventional operations as well.
Thanks, John. And I hear you. And there's this balance that gets talked about in Europe, and maybe not in these terms exactly, but I'll frame it this way if it's helpful, between when we think about resilience. And there's broad acceptance of the need for this whole of society mobilization, and some question about, well, how does it get operationalized? How does it happen? And the civil engineering piece is pretty, I mean, it can be very difficult and very expensive, but it's fairly uncontroversial. We need to protect the power grid and undersea cables and the rest of it. Straightforward proposition there. The social engineering part of it gets more challenging. And you made reference to, Russian focus on information operations and influence and subversion. And we've seen a laboratory of that in Ukraine. And Europe is trying to figure out how to respond. And part of that response has become quite politicized if and when and as it drifts toward censorship and toward, maybe the cancellation of elections that don't go the right way. And I wonder, you mentioned examples before around transparency and the rest. Like, are there other ways? If we think about the toxicity in a way and some of the genuine risks around censorship as a tool for the greater good, quote unquote, how can Europe reframe and sort of reset that discussion to be effective in your view?
Certainly, also an excellent question and a very difficult one for Europe to grapple with. Of course, as you said, going to one extreme with censorship is not ideal. At the same time, without significant or better regulations and better understanding of the threats out there, that's also not good. And so, I do think to the extent that European governments, but also civil society, media outlets, journalists, non-governmental organizations really all need to work together and to identify the threats and come up with plans to address them and to mitigate against them. I think the private sector has a very important role to play here as well, particularly in the critical infrastructure sector, energy, transport, communications, etc., finance as well. Particularly due to the potential for increasing cyber attacks and globally there are a number of actors out there beyond Russia that also have significant cyber capabilities. So I think that's just a good thing to do even beyond Europe in terms of cyber and infrastructure hardening and protection. But really working with local law enforcement, intelligence agencies, private sector, but again, civil society as well. So part of it is just sharing information, working together to, again, identify and mitigate threats, but then also informing the public as to what those threats are. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really, really important to attribute where some of these threats are coming from. And if they're coming directly from Russia or Russia-backed sources, that the European governments need to not be afraid to publicly speak up, and so that people are aware. Of course, there's always the potential for backlash. Russia does have a lot of levers of influence or pressure over Europe, particularly in the energy sector, but again, also in cyberspace and elsewhere. So I think just Europeans need to be better prepared for some of the challenges, and also that does require some further thought in terms of military expenditures as well, both for members of NATO and non-European members of NATO also.
Thanks, John. And I'll try to bring the U.S. into this a little bit now. And there's a lot of talk in politics on both sides of the Atlantic about the nature of the relationship and the interdependencies between the U.S. and different European states, the U.S.'s place in NATO. And I wonder your view on if there is a way ahead, again, to put aside some of the ferocity or the polemic nature of those debates, to think about what a working relationship looks like in defense of Europe. And if we can accept a reality where Europe presently, I don't say it lacks the ability, but it's facing an uphill battle to defend itself in traditional kinetic means. What is the sort of comparative advantage, quid pro quo, that Europe can offer the US to make them, it's not saying an attractive partner, but like to make it a real partnership and to try to find some sort of middle ground where the US can do what it does well, different European states can do what they do well, and together it is, once again, what it was meant to be in the beginning, which is, a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Do you see any ways ahead from the European side of what they can offer?
Certainly. And I think I would say not all allies or partners have to agree on every single thing, just as not all, friends or family members necessarily agree on every single thing. And I think the history of Europe and the United States, and just the broader transatlantic alliance, obviously so intertwined, politically, economically, militarily. And I'm hopeful that in some form will continue in a very robust way. I think it's critical for all in the transatlantic alliance, whether you're a NATO member or not, or a member of the European Union or not. But if you're in the European continent, what happens in Europe does directly impact North America, including the United States, and vice versa. Because of these interlinkages, if you will, particularly since World War II. I would say Europe has a lot to offer North America and the United States in particular, just dealing directly as the front line, so to speak, in this kind of global hybrid war, or global irregular war, if you will, dealing with Russia for the last 12 years. As I mentioned earlier, I think Europe has come a long way, still has a long way to go, but I am hopeful as to what it's achieved so far. I think the Americans, the United States, can learn a lot from that in terms of, for example, some of the NATO centers of excellence that have been stood up since 2014, like on cyber, on strategic communications, on just hybrid threats more broadly, and there are several others as well. And learning lessons, sharing those lessons with military and civilian professionals, security professionals, but also with publics, to better understand, again, the threats and how we can go about addressing them. I think also, obviously, there's been a lot of talk, necessary talk, for NATO members to increase their defense expenditures, and a number of them have done that. There's still a lot of work to be done there, but that's also another way I think that Europe can help. I think also, continuing support to Ukraine is critical, militarily, but also economically also. I realize there is a lot of Ukraine fatigue in the West, both in Europe and in North America as well, given the dozen years of support, but even support prior to that, as Ukraine became an independent state. Having said all that, I think we have seen Ukraine make a lot of progress on the battleground. I think we see that there's tremendous potential of its people in terms of its own resilience. And I think the United States and Europe can learn a lot from that resilience, this really whole society resilience and this national unity, which I think is not something that should be overlooked. It's very critical for the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian nation, but I think really any country, that the sense of unity, despite where there can be internal divisions, can really be a critical factor to stop hybrid threats. And then maybe just the last point, and it's related to better understanding just the hybrid threats emanating from Russia, let alone elsewhere, but really in the cognitive domain, the information domain, where there is influence being undertaken by a state actor, it's really critical to better understand that influence, better understand what's fact from fiction. So broader information literacy, and I think seeing what Ukraine has done in that space, I think also seeing what different European countries have done in that space, are other things that the United States can learn a lot from. And I will stop there.
I wanted to just maybe throw in a comment. You mentioned Ukraine and the civilian population, and actually the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian intelligence services have been, for instance, now with what's going on in the Middle East, have shown that Ukraine is a mature security provider. And I think that we're keeping the conversation 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when Ukraine actually is a security provider, unlike most NATO members on their own. So even President Volodymyr Zelensky talked about that. He mentioned Turkey, the UK, Ukraine, obviously, and Norway as security providers in Europe to maybe secure freedom of navigation and so on and so forth, access routes and trade routes. How do you manufacture resolve in Europe? Because a lot of the populations wouldn't fight, demographically speaking. If you look at the surveys, they're not interested in that. And even in my time in territory, I've encountered maybe members of the armed forces who are convinced that they will never have to be engaged in war. So how do we, as someone who spent time in territory talking to people, is there a way to manufacture resolve and to, because Ukraine is battling an existential battle, but at the same time they're learning and they're moving with the speed of light to adapt both to the battlefield and to technological reality. So what, I don't know if it's a comment, it's a question and a comment.
Great question and comment. I do fully agree. Ukraine has come quite a long way, and your point about it being security provider is extremely critical. I think that's another lesson that Europe and the United States, and frankly others around the world, can learn. It's not only Europe and North America that's seeing what's happening in Ukraine, it's other actors as well around the world, adversaries of Europe and the United States also. It is a live laboratory, if you will, in many ways for 21st century warfare. I think it's a good thing for Ukraine that they're becoming a security provider. I know that President Zelensky was recently in the Gulf, and what we see happening there in terms of drone technology using by Iran against a lot of the Gulf states. But Ukraine has something to offer to those countries, let alone Europe, and let alone the United States as well. I think there's tremendous opportunity for Ukraine in that regard, in terms of new technologies, not only unmanned systems, but also the use of artificial intelligence, AI, and some of the, the targeting, and then obviously aerial defense as well. It's really coming a long way and has come a long way. So I think Europe, the United States, and frankly, the world has a lot to learn from what's been happening and what Ukraine's been doing, to Ukraine's credit. Having said all that, you're right. In terms of Western resolve, your points about surveys and those, willing to fight.
Not just surveys. I traveled
Right.
and I spoke to people in
Yes.
universities, students, professors all over Europe, and the idea was, well, that's not going to happen.
Certainly, I certainly hope not. Ideally, war should be the very last resort for any state or any person. I do think, though, as Russia continues its attacks on Ukraine, not just kinetic ones, but also the non-kinetic ones, and as it continues the sabotage operations across Europe and other influence operations as well, that a lot of the battlefield is still going to be in the non-kinetic space, if you will. It still may be in the cyber domain, in the information domain, kind of more broadly. So that's where I think a lot of the focus does need to be. And it's not only a military tool that needs to address this. It really has to be civilian tools as well, including the average person in a given country. So hopefully it doesn't get to the point where you would have to have someone suit up, if you will, and fight on a particular kinetic battlefield.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'll go back to the comment you were making about Ukraine itself and the need for continued focus there, and Ukraine fatigue, etc. And again, thinking about another sort of near-term possibility, I mean, what is your view? And this is, again, big question, so answer it in your own personal capacity. But frankly, what are the odds that we get any sort of ceasefire in the near term, near to medium term? I think that in itself is plausible. But is it plausible that you get a ceasefire in the near to medium term that is sort of remotely acceptable on a level to the average Ukrainian that's either fought directly or been injured or contributed financially? Everyone's life has been disrupted. the war will end in some capacity at some point, or it will pause in some capacity at some point. And it will likely be on terms that are deeply dissatisfying. That's the nature of these sorts of negotiations and the way things look. What happens next? Because maybe Europe steps forward with some sort of, everyone talks about the Marshall Plan, right? That's our anchor historically.
Right.
But if you don't see continued support, and if you look at Ukraine, having done all it's done, achieved all it's achieved, wind up in a dissatisfying ceasefire without significant foreign investment support from the EU, et cetera. And this goes to, you can speak to your book a little bit too on, Russian approaches to Ukraine. Does it not become a playground once again for all this kind of hybrid warfare, all these kinds of different attacks where you have all kinds of new fault lines emerging in the veteran community, in politics? Who knows what Ukrainian politics are going to look like when they hit the reset button or the restart button there. The old paradigm feels pretty broken to me, with oligarchs and big state industries coming together to find political representation. I think we're past that. The oligarchs have been notably silent for the most part. They're out there. But there'll have to be some sort of new mechanism of politics, new mobilizing narratives, new mobilizing communities. And if we get to a place where there's a lot of frustration and a lot of dissatisfaction, and there's going to be 4 years of it that's been sort of self-censored effectively within Ukrainian society, is that, and maybe this contradicts my opening question to you, right, about Russia learning a certain lesson that this stuff didn't work. Maybe it gives them another opportunity to go for it again and to continue. And I guess I'd really be interested in your view as someone who's worked in these spaces and been there in a diplomatic civil society type capacity. What is the readiness, I guess, of the Ukrainians to withstand another 5-10 years of this? And what is the appetite in Europe to stick around and keep paying attention?
Yes, great question. It's really the $64 million question. I do also think and hope that a ceasefire can be achieved relatively soon. And I think there's been some reporting in the press relatively recently from senior Ukrainian officials that it's possible. And I hope that's the case. Obviously there's been significant losses on both sides in terms of Ukrainians and Russians as well. And the war has been going on, at least a full-scale invasion, for over 4 years. And Russia's been intervening for over 12 years, kinetically and non-kinetically, and obviously even prior to that in terms of its influence going back to the Soviet era. Having said all that, I do think there is a lot of Ukrainian resolve and resilience and unity, but I also think you're right. This has been going on for quite so long. I think Ukrainians, the average person in Ukraine, is probably very tired of this and just wants an opportunity to go forward. I think you're also right. Usually when a ceasefire happens and there's some kind of peace agreement, usually the measure of, at least one measure of how successful it can be, is that neither side is fully happy with the agreement, if you will. So I'm hoping that whatever is agreed to, that the Russians have to give in more on their side. They've been pretty unwilling to do that so far. And so I think, and I hope that there's more pressure that can be applied to them in terms of coming up with an agreement that's fair to both parties. I think we just have to see what that looks like going forward. But I also see, to the other part of your question, that this is likely to be a lingering issue for quite some time, because even if there is a ceasefire or a full-scale peace agreement that's lasting or sustainable, Ukraine is going to need a lot of help to rebuild, because a lot has been damaged or destroyed in many parts of the country. A lot of civilians have been killed, let alone military professionals as well. And there's going to need to be a lot of time for healing in terms of the population. So I think this is something that, unfortunately, is likely to be something that Europe and frankly, the transatlantic alliance, including the United States, is going to have to work at for quite an extended period of time. But having said that, I think given the potential that we've seen and the resilience we've seen amongst the Ukrainians so far, I think Ukraine has a lot to offer and can take a more leading role than a traditional aid recipient, maybe historically. And so I think there can be a true partnership going forward, once there's a ceasefire and a peace agreement. But I think that it will take some post-conflict reconstruction, so to speak, if you will, for lack of a better term.
If you don't mind, I would like to go back a little bit about what you mentioned about Russia changing their mind and them being steadfast in what they were asking for. Russia has been, when President Vladimir Putin took over power, he wrote an article where he laid out his vision for Russia. And since then, it was Russia in the 21st century, right? So since then, they've stuck to their strategy, to their long-term goals, which have consistently been to dilute US power globally. This was the first main goal. As a former diplomat and someone who's been in this capacity and has been on this end of government, do you think it's wise for Europe to plan for war, hoping to change someone's mind? Or do you think they would be better off understanding the other side and being ready to engage diplomatically, as well as, God forbid, it gets to kinetically? Which one do you think is wiser?
That's also a very good question. It's something that I tried to also examine in my book in terms of Russia's perspectives on the West, in terms of its own strategy and in terms of its own foreign policy and information security and military doctrine. I do think it's critical for the United States and Europe to understand Russia's perspectives. And by understanding it, that does not necessarily mean we have to agree with it.
Absolutely,
but we certainly,
exactly.
Yeah, but we do need to understand it. We do need to understand that historically, Russia has seen, and not just since Putin, but going back much longer than that, much before Putin, a fear of encirclement by whether it's Nazi Germany or Napoleon, but just this fear that it's being encircled or potentially could be encircled, and that historically it needs buffer states, such as Ukraine in its perspective, and needs spheres of influence, etc., from its perspective. Again, whether we agree with that or not is not the point, but we do need to understand that. And we also need to understand that Russia has seen support for what we in the West would call democracy building or promotion, which we traditionally see as a positive thing or a good thing. I think from the historic Kremlin perspective, at least for the past 20 plus years, dating back to the early 2000s with the so-called color revolutions, Russia, the Kremlin, really seeing those efforts as efforts by the West, led by the US, to encircle and or try to weaken and or overturn the Russian regime. We in the West haven't seen it that way. We see it as we're supporting democracy in these independent countries who want to have a more Western trajectory. So that's a good thing. But Russia has a very different perspective. Again, we don't necessarily have to agree with that, but we do need to understand that. So I do hope that from the European side, that they better understand and have some engagements about this with the Kremlin to perhaps come up with, this could also be in relation to the war in Ukraine as well, but just broader understanding of their perspectives, and maybe there are ways to come to terms on some things. I know that the Kremlin has viewed EU enlargement or NATO enlargement as direct threats to Russia as well, let alone color revolutions. Again, from our perspective, these are independent sovereign countries who want to choose their own trajectories. And so that's what they're doing, and we should be supportive. I don't know if there's ever going to be full agreement on these points. Probably not, at least not with the current regime in Moscow. But I am hopeful that, and this is what diplomats should be doing and should be working tirelessly at, particularly in Europe, whether you're an American diplomat or you're a European diplomat, or from another country, you really need to find where the common ground is, potentially, even if the space is extremely limited or seems impossible. That is the role of diplomacy, to find where there may be avenues of cooperation and using our own, power of persuasion or influence or soft power, if you will, to do so, just as any other diplomat from another country would also do. But it's really, really critical in terms of going forward and not constantly being in a situation where we in the West are concerned about Russia's further advances into the West, not only militarily, but also non-militarily, where we are seeing, I think, Russia having a fair amount of at least tactical successes.
Thanks, John. This is all really interesting. I'm trying to stitch some of it together in my head as we come toward the end. And maybe a way to do that is to think about, again, a near-term reality, which I think is very much in the cards. It's a personal view. But if we think to what we've all been talking about over the last 40 minutes or so, I think we're looking at a near-term reality where the Russians may look back at the downside risks of protracted sort of multi-vector hybrid war, whatever we want to call it, whatever they did to Ukraine. All right, we've all watched that. We've seen it. We've watched that inadvertently create the kind of resilience and capacity that the rest of Europe needs. And it's an open question as to how the rest of Europe can try to absorb some of those lessons and absorb some of that capacity from what the Ukrainians went through, from what they've done. So I think we're looking potentially, and let me know what each of you think, at a near-term scenario where Russia might be thinking, hey, we ought to move faster. We ought to move more aggressively. We ought to not give Europe the time that it desperately needs to get itself organized, to get itself mobilized, to harden its defenses, to strengthen civil society, et cetera, and be more proactive and really push on Europe itself. And then concurrently, if we think about this ceasefire scenario, which again may be a real term, near-term prospect, maybe it's a little ways down the road. If Europe has its hands full sorting its own internal interests, Ukraine itself runs a real risk of becoming this laboratory experiment for Russian statecraft and undergoing, all of what it's been through for the past 2 decades, or however we want to delineate that, for generations, let's say. But having just gone through 4+ years of intensive combat and intensive suffering and intensive disruption, I see that as the future for Europe. And I'm wondering, on the one hand, do each of you agree or disagree? I'm not saying I'm right. Maybe, maybe not. So in and of itself, do you think that's what's coming in the next 12 months or so? And if that is what's coming, what should the U.S. be doing? Right? What is the U.S.'s role? And there's a give and take there. It's not up to America to come in and rescue Europe. It's up to the Europeans and the Americans to come to terms through diplomacy, through whatever means possible, to figure out, all right, what do we owe each other? What are we doing for each other? What does this look like? And what role do the Europeans want America to play in that kind of scenario, where you have, again, re-escalating hybrid attack in Ukraine, dividing and degrading once again, and also escalated activity in Europe. And John, please, I'll start with you, and then Olga, I would welcome your thoughts on this too, to close out.
Sure. So certainly I'll be relatively quick. I do think Russia will continue to try to exploit any tensions there are in the transatlantic alliance. And obviously there are tensions within the NATO alliance. I think they'll do whatever they can to continue to exploit that. If it means going faster, in terms of what it's doing. I think it would do so if it could. But Ukraine has a vote, Europe has a vote, and the U.S. has a vote in this. And I would say Russia may try, but I think we have seen, again, just tremendous resilience by Ukraine. It obviously continues to need to have Western military and economic support to be able to continue defending itself. But I am hopeful, at least in the near term, that will continue. But realities are emerging that a ceasefire and a peace agreement do need to be reached sooner than later, which is, frankly, needed. And that Ukraine really needs an opportunity to kind of move forward with its own development and trajectory as soon as possible. I'll stop there.
Well, I've always been of the opinion that Russia and the Russian decision-making apparatus is foundationally different than ours. So their view and their Weltanschauung is very different than ours. And I always thought that setting out to change their mind is not a strategy altogether, or to go out of our way to destroy the Russian Federation as a state on its own. What I noticed now is that they indeed are talking about, they think that they were restrained in their actions. So they're looking now at the world, not just Ukraine, because just like you wrote a book about Syria and Ukraine, it's a big world out there and it's all interconnected. They are, I think, I assess that they are recalculating everything. So I don't know that. I don't know. I don't have enough information to know what it will be like a year from now, but I do know that two things: that they've seen the world differently, and that they are reassessing what they consider to have been a restrained approach to Europe. So I think this on its own should be a good enough thought-provoking answer for decision makers, strategists, and practitioners, as well as the public, because we live in a interconnected world where politically we're polarized, but economically and technologically we're all interconnected to each other.
I think that's a great note to end on here. Yeah, I think Europe has a lot coming its way, and I'm hopeful that there's a transatlantic solution to that, right? A partnership to be continued there. But look, thank you to everyone who joined in to the Irregular Warfare Initiative's Fireside Chat series today. On behalf of the Europe program, I want to thank you all for tuning in and give, again, a shameless call for input here. Plug for the Europe program. Anyone out there who wants to write, anyone out there who wants to get on one of these with something to say, please do so, particularly, but by no means exclusively. Remember, we have the Ukraine Hub. All due respect to Armo, our colleague who's on the front right now, leading the Ukraine Hub, and the Resistance Hub as well. We're comfortable in Europe talking about resilience. We may also have to talk about resistance in the not too distant future. So we're very much open and eager for input from anyone out there with practical real world experience of doing this and seeing this and navigating it all, to reach out, get in touch, and we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Much appreciated all.